joining in shortly.
Why you people slaying here?
Year of Learning sponsors Sue Ann Arnie Garlick, in memory of Malka Pearl Mann and Philip Mann, and a memory of family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah bat Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, shall share her children and grandchildren. In memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Harav Akiva, Marcia Federbush and family. In memory of her husband, Dr. Oriel Paul Federbush, Oriel Pinchas ben Harav Shimon, Sharon and Fred Lisker, their family and many friends. In memory of her dear mom, Harriet Friedman Edelbas Yaakov, Leslie and Gail Kaplan. In memory of their parents, Harry and Marjorie Siddell and Irving and Pearl Kaplan. Friends of Avi Gitler, Avram Meir Ben Shimon, and Martha Gitler, Charna Bas Yeshaya. Friends of Toby Peres, Saratova Bat Yisrael Dov. Friends of Malka Levi, Malka Bat Yosef. Friends of Joe Wolf, Yosef Ben Chaim. Many friends of Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom Ben Yitzchak Halevi. A Month of Learning by Haran and Mel Haller, in memory of her father, Yosef Eliezer Ben Tzvi Hirsch, P.B. Pizer, in memory of her father, Yischadov Ben Shmuel, Mordechai and Miriam Burr, in memory of his mother, Manya Bas Harav Shimon Halevi, Stanley Presser, in memory of his wife, Chayalea Bat Ze'ev HaKohen. Also, a week of learning was sponsored by Bonnie Galb Jackson, in memory of her father, Mordechai Yoel Ben Binyamin, by Judy and Michael Poretsky, in memory of her mother, Razel Bas Yehuda Leib. And today, we have a day of learning sponsored by Corinne Greenwald, in memory of her husband, Yitzchak Ben Pinchas. May Neshamas have an aliyah, Krank Rafia, Velti Yeshir Shai Matliya, and L'chol B'nai Yisrael, good Geben Shtiar.
Amen.
Okay. If we, for today's Gemara, right? Should be, right? The Kaf Aleph, but before we start there, let's go back just briefly, the very bottom of Kaf Amud Beis. Okay. I'm going to start towards 5 lines from the bottom on Kaf Amud Beis. Tanu Rabbanan, a new Braita, is said as follows. Right. What was it that they were saying there? Okay, actually, Imolei Galgal Chama, regarding the circle of the sun, right? Nishma Kol Hamona Shel Romi. We would have heard the sounds of the crowds in Rome. V'Amalei Kol Hamona Shel Romi, and were it not for the sounds of the crowds of Rome, Nishma Kol Galgal Chama. Okay, we'd have heard the movement of the sun. Okay? Now, Tanu Rabbanan, says the Braita. Okay, 3 lines up on the bottom of Kaf Amud Beis. Shalosh kalot holchim misof ha'olam v'yad sofo. There are 3 sounds, 3 voices that traverse the world. Okay, in this case, from one end to the other. Ve'eluhein, and they are as follows. Kol galgal chama. One is the sound of the movement of the sun. Second, V'kol Hamonah Shel Romi, the tumult and sound of the crowds in Rome. And the third, V'kol Neshama B'sha'a Sheyotz'a Min Haguf, and the sound of the soul as it leaves the body. V'yesh Omrim Af Leda, and there are those that say also the sound of childbirth. Okay, on top of Kaf Aleph, our daf for today. Right? V'yesh Omrim, and there are those who say also Af Ridiyah, the sound of the angel Ridiyah. It was basically described as the angel of water, and it was considered the sound of the water hitting the channels and the swamps in Bavel. Okay. Now, Gemara says, Uba'u Rabbanan Rachme, and the rabbis prayed for mercy, right? What did they pray for? Aneshama b'sha'ai sheyotz'a min haguf ubaltuha. And regarding the example of the soul exiting the body, that it not make a sound, and that was done away with. Tanya Kavate de Rabbi Shila. Now we saw earlier a Braita, okay? Now this Braita was Rabbi Yehuda. Now this Braita is according to Rabbi Shila. Hayotze l'derech kodem kriyat hagever. Remember, all of this was based on the fact of, do we understand kriyat hagever as, according to Rabbi Shila, the rooster, or according, I think, to Rabbi Yehuda, where it was the crier, C-R-I-E-R, the Kohen whose role it was to be on top of a turret and to call out, to tell Kohanim to get ready for the first lottery, and Levi'im to go to stand on the Duchen, and the Yisraelim to get ready to participate in the Ma'amad. Okay? So this Braita, according to Rabbi Shila, okay, is that one who goes out on a trip before the rooster crows, so to speak, right? Damo barosho. He takes his life into his own hands. Hey, his blood is on his own head. Rabbi Yoshia Amar, says Rabbi Yoshia, ad sheyishneh, until the rooster crows twice. V'yesh omrim ad sheyishalesh, and others say until the rooster crows 3 times. Ube'ezer tarnagol amru, and with what kind of a rooster are we talking about? B'tarnagol benoni, with a average size, or average type of rooster, one that doesn't crow early or late. Excuse me. Now, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, this is Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. B'sha'ah Yisrael olin l'regel, at the time that the Jewish people would go to the Beis HaMikdash, okay, on a holiday, omdim tzfufin u'mishtachavin revachim, that they would stand in the temple courtyard so pressed together, so to speak, right, that they were close one another, but when they bowed, there was ample space, extended space between them. V'nimshachim echat asra ama achrei beit hakaporet. And when they did bow, the size of the crowd extended basically for 11 cubits past the Beit HaKaporet, but behind the Holy of Holies. Mai Ka'amar, what is he saying here? Hachi Ka'amar. This is what he means to tell us. Afal pi shenim shachin echat esrei ama achrei Beit HaKaporet, even though, okay, when the crowds bowed, okay, and remember when they're talking about bow, they're talking about the kind of bowing that's done on the high holidays in our day now, okay? going all the way down to the floor, things like that. Okay, v'omdim tzifufin, and when they stood up, okay, it was crowded. K'shehen mishtachavin revachin. When they bow, then they do bow with adequate expanded space between them. V'zeh echad me'asara nisim shene'asu b'mikdash, and this was one of the 10 miracles that occurred in the Beis HaMikdash, Ditznan, as we're taught elsewhere in a Mishnah. Asara nisim ne'asu b'Beit HaMikdash. There were 10 miracles that occurred in the Beis HaMikdash. 1. Lo hipila isha mireach basar hakodesh, that a woman never had a miscarriage because of the odor of the offerings, the flesh that was burnt. Number 2, v'lo hisriach basar hakodesh me'olam, and there was never a terrible odor, a putrid odor by the offerings, okay, at all. Number 3, v'lo nir'eh zvuv b'beit hamitbachim, and there was never seen any flies in the area, I'm going to say, of the butchers. Okay. Number 4, v'lo ira keri lekohen gadol b'yom haKippurim, and the Kohen Gadol never had a seminal emission on Yom Kippur. And the next, v'lo nimtza pasul ba'omer, and there was never found any item that rendered invalid either the Omer offering, or shtei halechem, or the 2 loaves for Shavuot, u'belechem apanim, or the showbread on Shabbos. Okay. Now, coming back to the discussion here. Okay, omdim tzfufin u'mishtachavim revachim. We commented that was one example, that they stood crowded, but when they bowed, there were ample spaces. V'lo hezik nachash va'akrav b'Yerushalayim. So we mentioned that. We refer it here again to the bowing and the standing. And then we go on to another one, that no one was ever hurt by a snake or a scorpion in Jerusalem, right? The implication being that the city was quite populated, and as a result, okay, there were no place for nests for these creatures. V'lo amar adam lechavero tsar li hamakom sha'alin. And no one ever said when they came on a holiday to spend time in Jerusalem, that basically I have no place to stay. People would always show hospitality and put the Ole Regel up. So the Gemara says, Sha'alin b'Yerushalayim. Okay, so the Gemara now questions the fact that here we listed all of these, started talking about these miracles in the Beis HaMikdash, but then we expanded it to discuss other miracles throughout the city. So the response of the Gemara is, Patach b'Mikdash, v'siyem b'Yerushalayim. He began to talk about the Beis HaMikdash and finished with all of Jerusalem. That seems problematic, okay? So the Gemara answers, Ika tarte achrinaita b'Mikdash. In fact, we have the last 2 that deal with the Beit HaMikdash. Titania, as it was taught in the Braita, Me'olam lo kavu gshamim esh shel atzei ha'ma'aracha, that there never was an occasion where rain would come and put out the fire on the arrangement of wood on the outer altar, on the big mizbeach. Secondly, va'ashan ha'ma'aracha afilu kol haruchot sheba'olam ba'ot menashavot bo, ein mezizot oto mimkomo. That as far as the smoke going up from the ma'aracha, Okay, it would go straight up, it would appear, and a wind, no matter how strong, okay, would never move it in any one direction. Now, having cited these two additional miracles that we say were associated with the Beis Hamikdash, the Gemara asks, V'tu leka, and no more? V'hatanya, but aren't we taught elsewhere in a Braita? Rav Shemaya b'Kal Navo, according to Rav Shemaya of Kal Navo, Shivrei Klei Cheres Nivla'in Bimkoman, namely that those utensils that were made of pottery that could have held the dam, the blood, and things like that, if they concerned become tameh and they had to be shattered, okay, they could be thrown down to the ground and the ground would automatically reabsorb them. Va'amar Abai, and Abai suggests another one, okay, Mora'a, the crop of the bird, okay, V'notza, and its feathers, V'dishon, Mizbeach HaPnimi, and the ashes of the inner altar, V'dishon HaMenorah, and the ashes of the candelabra, okay, Nivla'in Bimkoman, they were swallowed up in their places, okay? Therefore, it wasn't a question of being concerned about having to bring them outside of Yerushalayim. So the Gemara says, well, if you're adding these additional miracles, you just said there were 10, how can you add these additional and still keep that number, right? So it says, Psulei Tlata, the example of those three, okay, namely we said that was the Omer and the showbread and the Shavuos loaves, right? Havu chashvinhu b'chad. They were considered not three separate miracles, but one idea. So the Gemara responds, therefore, afik trei, va'ayil trei. So you remove two and you add two. Ihachi, if that's the case, says the Gemara, blu'in nami trei havu, chashvinhu be'echad. Then the examples of those two items which were reabsorbed into the ground, even though they were two, they also should be considered one, right? Chasro laho, and therefore you're going to be lacking one. Ikanami, achrite, and there is possibly another, says the Gemara. The Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who says as follows, Nes gadol haya ne'esa belechem hapanim. There was a great miracle that occurred with the Shabbos showbread. What was it? Sluko kisiduro. That when it was removed, it was like it was put back. In other words, the same quality, freshness, warmth of the showbread when it was removed after 1 week on Shabbos was no different than when it was put into the, what do you want to call it? The showbread structure, okay, on the table, right? V'tu leka, I'm sorry, all right? Sluko kesiduro, shene'amar, as it says, l'shum lechem chom biyom chelka cho, biyom hilachto. Okay, that it should be warm the same way it was taken. Gemara says, v'tu leka, and no more. V'hamar Rabbi Levi, davar zeh masoret biyadenu me'avotenu. We have another example, he says, that we have a tradition from our ancestors that tells us as follows, okay, that we must remember that this width of the Heichal was 20 cubits. And how wide was the Aron? That was 10 cubits. But what about this kruvim? And so therefore he tells us, Makom Aron Eino Min Hamidah, that the size, the measurement of the Aron wasn't part of the measurements inside the interior of the Kodesh Kadoshim. Va'amar Rabbanai, Amar Shmuel, and says Rabbanai in the name of Shmuel, Kruvim Benes Hayu Omdim, that included also the Kruvim. Okay, some display them as being on top of the Aron, others saying they were beside the Aron. Okay. Now, Gemara wants to clarify. We've been talking about, in a sense, miracles that occur inside the Beis Hamikdash, right? Whether it's the earlier Ulam, let's say, or then the Kodshei Kadoshim. But then we referred also to other examples that were outside, and therefore the Gemara tells us. Nisei de Bara'ai, those miracles that were outside, Kachashiv, they were considered and included. Nisei de Gavai, those miracles inside, Lo Kachashiv. He did not count them and consider them significant to be included here. Ihachi, if that's the case, says the Gemara, Lechem Apanim, Nami Nisei de Gavayu, then the miracle of the Lechem Apanim, which would be considered an inside miracle, why is it even here? Lechem Hapanim Nisei de Baraihu. We consider the miracle related to the Lechem Hapanim as outside. Why? De Amar, Reish Lakish, as he said, Mai Dichtiv. What does it mean when it's written in the pasuk Al HaShulchan HaTahor, on the table that is pure? What do we mean? Tahor, Miklal, Shahu Tameh. We say that it's the pure table because it has the potential of becoming Tameh. How is that possible? As we go over to the next Amud. Kli eitz ha'asui lenachatu. Okay? Namely, it was put on a table initially made from wood, right? And that resting on it, and therefore a wooden vessel doesn't become tameh. The kol kli eitz ha'asui lenachat eino mekabel tuma, and any utensil, right, that's used for resting, in other words, for placing things in it, okay, doesn't become tameh. V'chotzeitz b'fnei hatuma. Not only that, but it should actually set up a limit, a barrier for tuma, for any kind of uncleanliness, right? That's so long as it's not moved. Ela milamed, says the Gemara, shemagbehin oto le'olei regalim v'omrim lehem ra'u chibatchem lefnei hamakom. Okay, that they said no, says the Gemara, that we see that they actually lifted up the table on which the showbread was put and would display it to all of the pilgrims, okay, and would say to them, see how beloved you are. Re'u chibadchem lefnei hamakom, shesiluko kisiduro. Okay, that the miracle that occurs, that its removal is like its establishment. Okay, the same, we said, quality. Shene'amar, as it says in the pasuk, l'shum lechem chum b'yom hilach lakcho. Okay, so that again, citing the pasuk. Okay, let's go on now. So the Gemara, v'tu leka, and no more. V'ha'amar Rav Oshaya. But didn't Rav Hoshaya tell us as follows? B'sha'ah shebana Shlomo Beit HaMikdash, at the time that Solomon built the temple, natabo kol minei migadim shel zahav, that he planted all kinds of precious fruits made of gold. Vahayu motzein perotehen bizmanan, okay, and they would produce their fruit at the appropriate time. Ukesheharuach menashevet bahen noshrin, and when the wind would come and the blow, they would fall off. Shne'amar, as said in a pasuk, va'yirash kilvanon pirio.
This means Shlomo was able to grow gold? There was gold growing on a tree? Or the fruits were a color?
I'm going to suggest as follows, Bob, good question. I'm not sure if they really meant real gold fruit, okay? That's the base. They're dashing the
It was
pasuk.
probably the quality they're talking about.
Could be the quality. It's also, you may remember that when we talked about the description of the entrance area to the Kodesh Kadoshim, there were all sorts of look like tree design, okay? Made of that people would donate, and it would be like gold leaf, let's say, what we would call it today. And those were designs of, let's say, fruit, pomegranate and this and that, okay? Shiva meaning, right? And so that may be what it's referring to.
Okay.
All right? Ukashen nichnesu nachrim lahechal, yavesh. Okay, when the Gentiles entered the temple area, what happened? They dried up. Shnei uparach levanon umlau. Okay, the flower of Lebanon languished. Okay, so there too, again, the implication citing a pasuk, okay, was that trying to darshan the pasuk to give the message. Va'atid Kadosh Baruch Hu lahachziran, and ultimately in the future, okay, the Kadosh Baruch Hu will return them. Shnei Amar paroach tifrach v'tagel af kilit v'ranan kivod halvanon natan la. Okay, it will blossom abundantly, rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon will be given unto it. Okay. Again, another pasuk, this one from Isaiah. Now, what happens? We come back now to the issue of the miracles. Excuse me. Nisei de kavia lo kachashiv. Gemara wants to suggest, at first we said there was a difference between outside miracles and inside miracles. Now we have an alternative suggestion. Those miracles that were perpetual, ongoing, maybe that's what he didn't consider to be important enough to include. Hashta da'adit lahachi. Now that you've come to this idea, Aron ukruvim nami nisei dikavianenhu. The ark and the kruvim, aren't they also perpetual, ongoing miracles? Amar Mar, says Mar, said the master, va'ashan hamaracha, and regarding again another example, the smoke of the outdoor mizbeach going up, umi hava ashan b'maracha, and was there really smoke that ascended up, straight up, okay, from the assemblage of wood, from the arrangement, vahatanya. But aren't we taught, and now we're going to get into a sidebar, I'll call it, a new topic that is different, but based on the question of the smoke and the fire and things like that of the altar. Chamisha dvarim ne'emru be'esh shel ma'aracha. There were 5 aspects, okay, of the smoke rising from the wood, right? The pile of wood. Okay. What were they? That's what the Gemara is going to discuss now. Okay. And now we're going to see what they are. Rivutsa ka'ari. The first was that it was structured, okay, like a lion. It was bent around like a lion. Different explanations here. One said it was like a large piece of coal, or the flame was in the shape of a lion. Okay? Others said the strength of the fire was like that, like a lion. The strong, in other words, it was a very major burst of flame. Second, ubarach kechama. It was clear like the sun. Third, v'yesh ba mamash, that one could almost feel the fire. Next, va'ochelet lachin kiv'yeshin, that it could consume wet wood just as easily as dry wood. Next, ve'ena ma'ale ashan, okay, and it did not produce a lot of smoke. Now, kika amrina, as we would say, behedyot, as would be done in private. Okay, so the implication was that when it was a private person that brought a korban, there was very little, if any, smoke. But when it's a offering that's a communal offering, especially major occasions, one would think that multiple animals, on the Mizbeach would produce a lot of smoke. Titania, as taught in the Pasuk, V'natnu b'nei Aharon HaKohen eish al HaMizbeach. Okay? Namely, Afal pi she'esh yoredet min hashamayim. When it says the Kohanim put fire on the altar, we understand it to mean as follows, that even though a fire may have come down from heaven, mitzvah lahavim min hahedyot, that it was appropriate for the Kohanim to also light the ma'aracha from underneath, just as with a private or an individual offering as well. Okay. Now, how do we understand these 5 aspects of the ma'aracha, the fire and the ma'aracha? Number 1, rivutsa ka'ari. We said it was shaped like a lion. Vahatanya. But wasn't it taught elsewhere in a Braita? Amar Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim. Rabbi Chanina, assistant head of the Kohanim, tells us, Ani re'itia uruvutsa kekelev. I saw it, and it was shaped more like a dog. Lo kasha. It doesn't have to be problematic. Why? Kan b'mikdash rishon, kan b'mikdash sheni. In one case, we're talking about the first temple, in the second case, the second temple. So the Gemara asks, Ubamikdash Sheni mi havai? And in the second temple, didn't that exist as well, the fire that would come from heaven? Okay. Vaha'amar Rav Shmuel bar Ini. But didn't Rav Shmuel, the son of Ini, tell us, Mai dichtiv? What is it written when it says in the Pasuk, okay, that I will desire it and I will be honored. Ukrina, and we read it v'achabda, and I will honor, so to speak, it with the extra hey. Okay, what does that seem to tell us? Ma'ishna de mechusar hey. What is so unique or different that the ktav is lacking the hey, whereas we read it, the kray includes it? Ela chamisha devarim shahayu bein mikdash rishon lemikdash sheni. This symbolizes the 5 differences that existed between the first temple and the second temple. The Eluhain, and these are suggested as follows. 1, Aron, the ark itself. V'kaporet, number 2, the ark covering. Ukruvim, number 3, the kruvim, the cherubim. Eish, number 4, the fire. Ushchina, the divine presence. V'ruach hakodesh, and the Holy Spirit, right? V'urim v'tumim, okay, and the Urim and Tumim. Amrei.
Rabbi, I thought the whole purpose of the Beis Hamikdash was to bring the Shekhinah to the world. So how could you have a Beis Hamikdash without the Shekhinah? It seems to be a real steerer, a real...
Yeah. When I was looking at it, Bob, I understood it to be the following. Shekhinah was a divine presence. You were trying to bring the Ruach HaKodesh implied prophecy.
Right.
And that was the difference between those 2 examples. Okay? But what was meant by bringing the Shekhinah there? In other words, perhaps the implication was the level of the people's relationship, the I'll call it the human divine attachment.
Right.
What Chassidus sometimes calls devekus. Okay? That was different in the Bayis Sheni than the Bayis Rishon.
Okay.
So the Gemara now responds, right? Having told us this, Amrei, and they said, En mahava hava, siyua lo misayeh. Okay, that in regards to that fire, it may have existed, but it did not bring a lot of benefit. It did not help per se in burning up the offerings on the Mizbeach, and therefore more work was necessary on the part of the Kohanim in terms of setting the Ma'aracha aflame to burn the offerings. Okay. Having talked then about fire, our text goes on with a new Braita. Tanu Rabbanan, says the Braita. Sheish Eshotein. There are 6 kinds of fire. Yesh Ochel, right? They're the first kind. Yesh Ochelet Ve'ena Shota. There is fire that consumes, okay? But it does not, in other words, it consumes solids, but it doesn't drink. It doesn't consume liquids. Second example, V'yesh Shota Ve'ena Ochelet. There are fire that does consume liquids, but it doesn't burn solids. Third example, V'yesh Ochelet V'shota. There's fire that both consumes solids and liquids. Next, V'yesh Ochelet Lachin Kiveshim. And fire that consumes wet objects as equally as well as dry objects. Okay. Next, V'yesh Eish Doche Eish. There is fire that can deter other fire. Okay. And next, V'yesh eish ochelet eish. And there's fire that can consume fire. Now, Gemara wants to clarify these for us. Back to our first example. Yesh eish ochelet ve'ena shota. When we say that there's fire that consumes solids but doesn't consume liquids, hadida. That's like what we have here. Okay. In other words, that's how we understand fire in a normal sense. Okay. Second, right? In other words, fire consumes a liquid, but it doesn't consume water. Okay. Or it can burn if there's oil on top of one, things like that. Second example, shoteh ve'ena ochelet. When we say that it can consume liquids but not solids, decholin, then we're talking about someone who is sick, who has a temperature. Okay, there we still use the expression somebody is burning up when they have a high temperature. Okay, the idea that not they, right? They don't have enough liquids in their body, but their body is still, right? Next example, ochelet v'shoteh de Eliyahu, that when we say that it consumes solid and liquid, that's the example of Elijah, okay, in the story, right? When he made the Mizbeach, right, on the Har Carmel, right, and he poured water how many times over the wood, and the fire came, and it absorbed both the offering, the wood, and the water. Okay, that's the example. Dichtiv, as it's written, ve'et hamayim asher b'ta'ala lechaka, that the water that was in the furrow, in the burrow, in the ground, okay, in the canal, was lapped up, so to speak. Okay, next, ochelet lachin kiveshim, that it consumes wet items just as easily as dry items. The ma'aracha, that's the example of the ma'aracha, the wood on the mizbeach. Okay? Ideally, they would prefer to use dry wood, especially wood without any worms, things like that, because that reflected the kavod, the honor, the glory, due Hashem. But nevertheless, that was their example. Yesh eish doche eish. We have an example, says the Gemara, of fire that can consume other fire. Eish de Gavriel. That's the example of Gabriel. Gabriel was known as a malach, the eish of fire. And what we're told, there's a midrash that says that when Nebuchadnezzar, I believe, wanted to put Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah through the furnace, Gabriel was the one that received Hashem's permission to go down, asked permission to go down and save them. And he went down, and his fire destroyed the fire in the furnace and to help them survive. Okay. Next, v'yesh eish ochelet eish d'shchina, and there is fire that can consume other fire, namely that of the shchina itself. Why? Da'amar ma, as a master said, hoshit etzba'o b'neihem v'sarfan. Okay, that Hashem would, if the angels disagreed with him, he had the ability to put his finger among them and burn them up. Now, let's go to the next piece. Again, another sidebar. Okay? Va'ashan hama'aracha, as far as the smoke that would come up from the ma'aracha, the wood arranged on the mizbeach, right? Afilu kol haruchot sheba'olam ein mezizot oto mimkomo. We said in the Gemara that even if all the wind in the world were to blow on it, it would not move the fire from rising up like a pillar. Okay. Koren actually has a nice picture of that, by the way, in its text. Now, V'ha'amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. But wasn't it, asks the question, said by Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, B'motzei Yom Tov ha'acharon shel Chag, that on the last day of the holiday of Sukkot, Hakol Tzofin la'ashan ha'ma'aracha, that everyone would, I'm going to say, fix their gaze on the smoke of the ma'aracha. Notek klape tzafon, if the smoke tended towards the north, aniyim smechim u'ba'alei batim atzavim. The poor were happy, and the well-to-do balabatim were sad. Why? Because it meant, that the issue was going to be a reflection of what the rain was going to come. Mipnei shegashmei shana merubim, because there would be a lot of rain, uperutehen markivim, and because of the excess rain, the crops of fruit, would rot, and therefore, number one, the owners would have to sell it at a cheaper price, and therefore the poor would benefit, but the owners would be sad because the fruit would then not be able to be stored and preserved. Secondly, Nata klape darom, if the smoke tended towards a southern direction, aniyim atzavim ubalei batim smechim, then the poor would be sad, and the balabatim, the owners, would be happy. Why? Mipnei shegashmei shana muatin uperutehen mishtamrin. Why? Because then, with less rainfall, the owners of the fields could charge more money for their crops, and the poor people would be hard pressed, right? But there would be plenty of produce, enough to put aside and to preserve. Going on, Nateh klape mizrach. If the smoke went towards the east, hakol smechim, everyone would be happy, right? In other words, it was just the right amount of rain that was going to come, just the right amount of produce, right prices. Klape ma'arav, if the smoke went to the west, hakol atzavin, everyone was unhappy. Da'azil va'ate kedikle va'avdure la hava mivda. Why? Because then the wind would blow back and forth like a palm tree, and it would disperse, throughout the area. And so you didn't know what the quality, when the rain would come, what the amount of rain, what that would do for the crops, so on and so on. Amar Mar, Master said the following: Klape Mizrach hakol smechin. No, he said that if it was towards the east, everyone was happy. Klape Marav hakol atzavim. Towards the west, everyone was sad. Urminhu, but we'll contradict this with another braita that tells us Mizrachit le'olam yafeh. Towards the east, we say that was fine. Maravit la'olam kasher. For the West, it was always difficult. Ruach tzfonit yafeh lechitin b'sha'a sheheviu shlish. A north wind was fine for the wheat when it reached a third of its growth. V'kasher lezeitim b'zman shehen chotin. But it was difficult for the olives at the time that they were beginning to ripen, to bud. Ruach dromit kasher lechitin b'sha'a sheheviu shlish. A south wind was difficult, for the wheat when it reached a third of its growth. V'yafeh lezeitim shehein chontin. But it was good for the olives at the time that they began to ripen and bud. V'amar Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says, V'itema marzutra, and others say a way of remembering, which wind was better for this and which was better for the other. V'simanach, and your mnemonic device to remember was that in the Beis Hamikdash, shulchan b'tzafon, that the table was in the north. In other words, the table for the showbread, bread which comes from wheat, and therefore north was good for it. Umenorah b'darom, and the candelabra was in the south, and the south wind was good for the oil, right, that came from the olives in order for the lighting of the menorah. Hai marbeh dideh, v'hai marbeh dideh. This one was good for this, and this one was helpful, good for the other. Lo kasha, or we can explain it differently, that it doesn't mean that it's problematic. Ha lam, one was for us, namely for those of us, that lived in Babylonia, because if there was a dry wind in Babylonia, which had rivers and therefore had a lot of water, it didn't harm the crops. V'halaho, and the other was for them. In other words, in Eretz Yisrael, a dry wind would be problematic because, with little water, they depended on the rain, and therefore it could ruin the crops. And that's how we finish up this Gemara. Hadran alach shivat yamim. We finish the parak, first parak of Yoma, and God willing, tomorrow we will continue parak Sheni.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Everybody
Thank
take
you,
care.
Rabbi. Have a good day.
very much.